So another question that arises is, how much should, let's say, an employee be paid compared to a CEO? And then we can, like, it's not like we have to, what we're trying to do is we're trying to appreciate the nuances here. It's not that oh, the employee should get paid the same. Nobody's saying that. Nobody who has a nuanced, well-informed stance on the issue would say that an employee, entry-level employee, should be paid the same as, you know, the owner or the CEO. But then we can ask the question: is it fair that a CEO makes, let's say, several multiples, if not 100 times, the salary of an employee? So what are the factors that go into that? The factors that go into that is, for instance, the CEO. You could talk about, let's say, competency, education. You could talk about a sort of risk sort of assessment idea, where, look, the person has a bigger responsibility. The CEO of Subway doesn't have the same degree of responsibility as, let's say, the teenager there that's making your sandwich. If the teenager makes a mistake, yeah, it might be regrettable, but it's not catastrophic. Whereas the CEO makes a mistake, you know, he might even, he might go to jail. People might get sick. It might be like it might be catastrophic. So there are different things to consider. Let me just try to put it. Actually, let me mention that. Let's go on, and then we'll sort of unpack this. So again, we're trying to basically contrast this. We're going to try to look. Well, it's really lagging here. So we're trying to contrast primarily these two philosophies: the philosophy of sort of laissez-faire capitalism, which would be what you would get with a libertarian, which is we're going to talk about Robert Nozick very, very quickly, and you can contrast that with an egalitarian position, which would be more socialist, as we said, with, let's say, privatized healthcare, let's say publicly funded healthcare in Canada, or the example that I mentioned of Cuba. So we'll talk about John Rawls, a sense of egalitarianism, and then we'll look at sort of Karl Marx and his critique of capitalism. Go ahead, John. You had a question or a comment?
Oh, never mind. I see you're recording now. I didn't see that. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so if we talk about justice, Aristotle mentions different types of justice. What we're primarily talking about is distributive justice. Retributive justice. Retributive justice has more to do with sort of punishment, okay? That, let's say, a wrong was done, so how is that sort of rectified? How is the score sort of balanced out? You don't really see that much in terms of sort of economic issues. Maybe, let's say, when there's a if you talk about, let's say, infringement on intellectual property, and somebody has to, let's say, pay a huge fine or something like that, that would be a some kind of a punitive measure. It would be retributive in an economic sense. We're talking primarily about the kind of distributive justice. That's primarily our aim. I think you can also talk about, let's say, compensatory justice. If something has wronged you, how can that be sort of corrected? In other words, punishing the person does address some sense of justice, but it doesn't give the person the victim what they themselves lost. So a simple example of this is what I believe we've already, I'm not sure if we touched upon this, but they say that, for instance, in about 20 years, 50% of the workforce will be laid off by a combination of automation and robotics and artificial intelligence. And then you might ask the question in a kind of from compensatory justice. Are these people that are being laid off, do they deserve anything? Or are they then sort of, you're on your own, you know? Do they deserve, you know, some people might say, no, they didn't invent the robots, you know, they don't maintain the robots. But in some sense, you can't even compete against the machine that you're being replaced against. You're being replaced by. And then on the other side, the more sort of socialistic idea would be people who advocate for universal basic income, which is you've been laid off, but you are nonetheless guaranteed basic income, basic livelihood, basic subsistence, as a kind of you can see it as a kind of a compensation. Okay, moving right along. So now I want to contrast these two positions. Okay, the position of sort of libertarianism, which is, to put it very simply, least government intervention possible. That it's the individual's rights that should be sort of respected, and optimally no government intervention whatsoever. So this is what you would get. Primarily, it seems to sort of sound like this sort of laissez-faire idea of capitalism, that you make your money and you should be taxed as least as possible, if not not at all. So this is Robert Nozick, okay, this principle of liberty, that there should be no restriction on individuals' liberties, even if doing so would increase overall happiness. That's pretty interesting. But let's try to unpack this, and I have a concrete example in my head. So this is kind of, it's a strange way to put it, but it's kind of it's simplistic and it makes sense. Basically, so I have a kind of a concrete example to go with this, and then a kind of a hypothetical question. So this is the principles, okay? The entitlement principle. And it's really the first two. Basically, you have a holding because you've acquired it in accordance with what is justly acquired. In other words, you merit it, okay? You've done this work, you've made this investment, you've taken this risk, you've built up this company, and there's a sense of sort of acquisition. There's a sense of merit and possession. It belongs to me. Okay, I'm entitled to it, and insofar as I'm entitled to it, in terms of individual rights, nobody should really have any authority to, let's say, what to do with my property or with my wealth, my assets, and so on. Okay, and the second one is basically, I can then transfer it to somebody, and I'm allowed to transfer it to whoever I want, and they then are entitled to hold it. Okay, and that's a kind of a legitimate transfer. A person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice and transfer from someone else entitled to the holding is entitled to the holding. So it's basically this sense of possession as being acquired or as being transferred in the second principle. So yeah, the first one is pretty straightforward. You know what I mean? It's like, if you're a businessman, you say, I don't need government intervention. If I don't want to take an insurance, I shouldn't be obliged to take an insurance. It's on me if something happens, and let's say my kitchen burns down in my restaurant. I assume that risk, and the government shouldn't tell me that I should have this insurance. It's clearly not the case here. My friend has a restaurant, and he says there's an insurance coming out of each hole. There's insurance. The second one, and this goes to sort of the hypothetical question I want to ask, would be the question of inheritance. And this is a question that I like to just ask at this moment is, and some students have very mixed reactions to this. So would you feel here, the case would be, should there be a limit on inheritance? And the answer is obviously no, okay? The holding, the estate was acquired legally under respect for the individual's rights. It is now being transferred, and it should not be infringed. There's nothing about that transfer that should be infringed upon. So basically, let me try to put that very simply. The question is, should there be a cap on inheritance, or should there be a tax on it? Some people say yes, some people say no. Some people think it's a fantastic idea. Some people are appalled by the idea. All right. So let me just kind of unpack that a little bit. So just give me, like, suppose this example is, and then I'll give you his Wilt Chamberlain example, okay, or whatever, LeBron James, whatever. But suppose your parents are multimillionaires. You've done nothing with your life, okay, because you know that you're in a rich family. You don't have to do anything. You know that it's going to come to you eventually. And so there's no sense of merit on your part. You haven't done anything. You haven't done any work. You haven't sought to replace your parents in their leadership position in whatever company or whatever. And your parents die and you get, let's say you're going to get $50 million. Some people might say, okay, well, did you say you're allowed $10 million or 20 million, but whatever money amount you want? It's like, good, you just won the lottery. You won the lottery because you happen to be born in a rich family. There's nothing that you did of your own merit. And here there is this sense of sort of merit, okay? Well, there's at least a sense of merit in the first sense. That it shouldn't be, so here you get sort of let me get a little bit sort of rough here. But this is what you get with the sort of the language of people that are opposed to funding social programs, socially funded education. The real believers in sort of trickle down market, sort of blind, the invisible hand, blind faith in the markets, is kind of trickle down economics. That basically the judgment that basically I'm working and these other people aren't working, and they're basically freeloaders. That you've kind of heard that, okay? The sort of the criticism of people, somebody who's on welfare, that they're basically just often when you get into the sort of less refined discourse around it, referred to as kind of leeches, like parasitic. We'll look at sort of the flip side of that when we talk about egalitarian. You have to ask yourself, are there people that profit from a collectivist system? Yeah, of course there are going to be always people that profit from it. But you'd say, what is the sort of the standard rule? What is the general rule? Is it people that are profiting? If you are really in line with this position, you may try to convince yourself and other people that that is the norm, that these are people, they are able-bodied, they're able to work, they are just lazy, and their laziness is sort of willful. It's a decision, and they can decide to work, but they're in some sense they're smart because they're gaming the system. They realize, well, why should I work and make this much money when I can just sit at home? Okay, and there's a kind of sort of a negative sort of judgment. There's a kind of a disdain of that. The kind of, well, is that kind of just a kind of a false? Is that just kind of a false positive? In other words, the person claims that they're unable to work, but they truly are able to work. Is that false positive? Is it the anomaly, or is it the norm? Somebody who is of this position may try to convince you that it is. It may not be the norm, but it's more widespread than it ought to be. Okay. So, for instance, should there be a capital inheritance? From this position, you would say, no, there shouldn't be a capital inheritance because it is transferred. Say, oh, look, maybe my son doesn't deserve it, but I deserve to say where my money goes, So when I die, it shouldn't be some third party that decides where my things that were earned of my merit, where they are transferred to. Yeah, there's some I've heard some students in the past say that they're completely opposed to this. And one student said, and now that I think about it, I feel a little bit bad for her, but she said, well, when my dad dies, I want all his money because he's so busy working that I hardly get to see him. So I might as well enjoy, the fruits of his labor once he's dead. Okay, fair enough. So, and then there's kind of a few ideas here. What's the main example here? The main idea is, for instance, he uses the basketball player, okay, the all-star on the team. The all-star, okay, and this leads to my other example. So this kind of the example that he uses and then leading to my example. The all-star on the team says, this year I'm going to sign the contract and I want $10 million a year. And what does the team owner do? The team owner says, okay, I'm going to give it to you. Not only because there's also kind of economic advantage to them, but you realize that there is a kind of, there's a productivity of this individual. There is something about this individual which generates more profits. He sells more tickets. And basically the point is, the game that we're playing here, we're not playing basketball. Yeah, we're playing basketball, but there's another game which is selling tickets. We're in the business of entertainment. You have to sell tickets, you have to sell TV contracts, you have to get ad revenue. So there's that other game. We are selling entertainment. And I am an entertainer, okay? I'm going to be able to put 40 points a game consistently. And so therefore, in other words, I'm doing more work here. I'm hauling more than everybody else on the team. I have the skills to do so. Therefore, I should deserve more. And that's understood. You know what I mean? Nobody would say all athletes should be paid equally. And then there's the whole debate of, should athletes be paid as much as they are? Well, at this point, they might as well be paid as much as they are, because they're sort of almost iconic religious figures. If you look at, let's say, soccer players are like basically considered like demigods. But you get the point. So, but the point is also this. The point is also, you cannot, no matter how good you are, you cannot win a basketball game alone. You nonetheless need a team. So I guess the point is, if you take up so much predominance and you suck up so much resources that you, let's say, that's when you have, let's say, a salary cap. And there always is, let's say, a salary cap, even if it's not enforced. There always is a sort of upper limit as to how much the management or the administration of the team can afford. So if you're sucking up all those resources, you're going to be playing with shitty teammates, and playing with shitty teammates, you may still score a lot of points, but you're not gonna be the champions at the end of the season. So that also has to be taken into consideration. Yes, sure, we have to try to carve out a middle ground here. Both of these positions are articulating something true: the libertarian and the egalitarian position, which I'll articulate in a second. So yes, of course, there is something about individual merit, but there's also something about laying down sort of the foundation with the other players, so that you can actually perform, and you can perform optimally. Let me try to give you this another example. This is kind of a personal example, not really. Well, I have a friend of mine who's a successful businessman, and he owns basically, let me just say, sort of a home renovation company. Let me leave it sufficiently general. And when he was starting out, and this was a number of years ago, he had an older employee, and he was fairly young at the time. He was like in his early 20s, and he had an older employee. I presume, let's say he was in his late 40s. And halfway through the summer season, when all the work was coming in, basically the employee said, "Why am I doing all the work and you're making all the money?" So he basically said, fuck off. I can do this myself. I can start my own company. And now, you see, they're both right. So let's try to articulate why they're both right. In some sense, my friend would not generate the profits that he did if it wasn't for the employees. The flip side of that is that the employees, now basically what happened, before I make the point, is that employee at the end of the summer, having not been too successful on his own, basically came back and sort of asked for his job back. And my friend's a bit of a hard ass, and my friend said, no, sorry, you know what I mean? You left on bad terms, and you missed your chance. So my friend is also right in that sense, because the employee was not the one who was necessarily taking what you would call the what's that word I'm looking for? You're not enterprising. You're not taking that risk. You're not sort of taking on the endeavor. And furthermore, you're not laying down the sort of the general techniques, the general structure to enable it to happen. So they're both right in a way, that the company would not generate revenue if it wasn't for the work of the employee, but the employee would not necessarily have a job if it weren't for the company. And that's basically the tug of war. It's a kind of a perpetual tug of war, okay, as to who's going to be right and who's going to be wrong. That you can basically squeeze the employee and say, no, you can't go off because you're going to fail. Maybe they might not fail. Maybe they'll be very successful if they go off on their own, okay? And basically you need me, and you get to the point where basically you can give people a wage labor. That's how Karl Marx defines the minimum wage. Minimum wage, he kind of defines it in a pretty crude manner. And the minimum wage is that in some places in the world. Okay, let me just give you that point. How does, first of all, how does Karl Marx define the minimum wage? Karl Marx says the minimum wage is how much can I give somebody so they have just enough energy to come to work and go home and sleep with their wife, so that we can have a subsequent generation of slave laborers. You know, we can, they will come to work, they have enough energy to come to work and basically raise a family, but that's it. They don't have enough energy to think too much or try to form a union or rebel. So the minimum wage is how much can I give this person so that they do not become independent of me, and that they stay alive so that they can furnish a next generation of minimum wage workers. That's a pretty bleak definition of the minimum wage. And there are many places where the minimum wage simply does not cut it. Then, for instance, as a kind of a personal experience, me and my wife were traveling back, and we had a layover in Geneva. And we realized that as two young professionals working in Canada, you can't really afford a meal in Geneva. You know what I mean? Even McDonald's was like going to be like $50. And we're like, you know what? I think we didn't eat that night, because I'm like, everything else is going to cost like $100, $200 for a very, very simple meal. McDonald's is going to cost us $50. And one of the reasons for that is because their minimum wage is quite good. Okay, it's quite sort of socialistic, where the minimum wage is like, basically, if I'm not mistaken, at the time was like about $18. So it's fantastic. You know what I mean? Everybody's happy. Everybody's happy except for the poor person. You know, they need to get out of there. So let's define sort of the second one here. Is it a question of the egalitarian perspective of John Rawls. So he says social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. I think this captures it. Actually, let me read both of them. Each person is to have equal rights to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties, compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. So you want to try to maximize sort of the common denominator. You want to try to maximize the common denominator. They're not saying that everything is equal. You can make more money, okay, but you want to try to arrange it so that there is an optimal common denominator. It's very sort of, it's articulated in an abstract way. And let me try to give you, I'll try to give an example of this. But basically, to put it very simply, is there should be at least some degree of redistribution of wealth, potentially through, let's say, a form of progressive taxation, where you redistribute, you tax obviously the richest people more, especially for their higher tax brackets, and you redistribute that wealth from the bottom up. Okay, so what is regarded as the least advantaged, the most marginalized, or the least advantaged, I think is the word that he uses, to the least advantaged up. Because there are people, he said, the point here is that there are people that are born with, they are in a circumstance that is an intrinsic disadvantage, that is of no fault of their own. They are not at a disadvantage of any virtue or any choice or any action of their own. So that's just simply a sort of a matter of fact, is some people are born with all the opportunities, and some people are not born with all the opportunities. Okay, some people are born with the shorter stick, and some people are born with a longer stick. Social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions: to be attached to positions equal to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity, and this is the point that I was making, and to give the greatest expected benefit to the least advantaged members of society. So some of you guys have seen this, and it might have been meaningful to put an image here, a visual here, but it's not too difficult to visualize it. Is basically you have, let's say, you have the tall person, the medium height person, and the short person, and they have these blocks. Okay, so the question is equality, does equality necessarily equate to fairness? And the idea is, let's suppose you have 6 blocks and you distribute the blocks. You say, okay, everybody gets the same. So everybody gets 2 blocks. Well, now you're giving, everybody wants to, like, let's say, look over the fence. That's like, let's say, the goal. Everybody wants to look over the fence. The tall person is already looking over the fence. The medium person, he maybe has to stretch a little bit, but he sees over the fence. And then the short person doesn't see over the fence. And then you have these blocks that they can stand on. And you have 6 blocks. So you would say, well, what matters is, equality across the board. But equality across the board would result in everybody getting 2 blocks. And the rich person here is sort of getting more of what, by analogy, the rich person is the tall person. The tall person is getting more of what he does not have any need for. So that goes back to the idea of sort of marginal utility is, as we said when we were talking about Epicureanism, okay? Maybe the first $50,000 or $100,000 that you make has a lot of utility, but once you're a billionaire and you add another $50,000 to that, even though it's the same amount of money, it has little utility for you. Whereas the 2 same blocks for the short person still might not put him over the fence. So what Robert Nozick would say as a libertarian is, if I make 5 blocks, but I'm already tall, those 5 blocks are mine. Okay, I'm gonna decide how to redistribute them. Okay, I might sell them, I might give them out of the kindness of my heart, but they're mine. Okay, I'm the one that has a say on what to do with the 5 blocks. Maybe the medium person got 1 block, and the short person, well, he's born short, so he had a disadvantage. And the disadvantage, you see how, let's say if you get points for seeing objects over the fence, the short person was born at a disadvantage and is perpetually going to say disadvantage. So there is, this is what somebody made this point there the other day. I forget who it was. Like, basically, once you're rich, not only is it easy to make more money, but let's say if you're a celebrity, especially, once you're rich and you're making more money, people also give you stuff for free. You know what I mean? So it's like, there was a commentator that I heard on the news not long ago talking about, like, specifically marginalized groups. And she said it's very expensive to be poor in the United States. And that's a fascinating way to look at it. Okay, I mean, proportionally speaking, it's very expensive to be, especially if you then start to talk about, being laid off work because of, illness, because of, I don't know, diet and all this stuff, chronic disease. It ends up being expensive to be poor. Whereas, let's say, a very rich person in the United States, wealth might not even be a consideration. You know what I mean? It's no struggle at all. So what would John Rawls say as an egalitarian? John Rawls would say, you have 6 blocks. It shouldn't even be 2, 2, and 2. It should be, you tax the tallest person because they have no use for it, and you give the tallest person will remain with 1, and you allocate that block to the least advantaged person, which is the short person, and in that way you create a kind of in some sense a level playing field. Now, there's a lot of pros and cons to both of these. So now the tall person has 3 blocks, he's able to see over the fence, and he's got a shot. You know what I mean? Now, if I think at that point you have to kind of draw a line. Otherwise, you keep progressing in that direction, and you end up in kind of a sort of a, I don't know, you end up in a situation which is kind of squanderous, or like a communist situation, where the person has the advantage. He's now able to play the game and see over the fence, and he's able to score some points, but he still does a bad job. Now, there has to be eventually some responsibility that falls on the individual. Okay. But then on the flip side of that is what you might get, and what we actually see is the rich person, you'd say, excuse me, do you have 3 blocks? And he's gonna say, no, I only have 2 blocks. So there's supposed to be 6 blocks here. We only count 5. Where's the 6th block? And it's in some offshore bank account somewhere, it's in Panama or something like that. So you guys maybe heard of the Panama Papers. Panama Papers is like this basically I don't know what it was. It was basically something that was uploaded to, like, let's say WikiLeaks or something, like a whistleblower that had basically revealed all the untaxed offshore bank accounts and tax havens of a bunch of rich people and celebrities. And and nobody talked, like, it hasn't really gone around to anything. Nobody got, I don't know. So, but it was major. It was a major scandal. Any questions, comments, thoughts, criticisms, reactions to any of this? Okay, moving right along.
Wait, hold on. So, John Rawls is equalitarian or egalitarian?
So, sorry, John Rawls is, John Rawls is the egalitarian. There should be a redistribution from the top to the bottom for the most disadvantaged people. And Robert Nozick is sort of the anarchist libertarian, where he says, it's yours, you keep it. You decide to do what you want with it. And we should try to minimize government intervention, as we said, even if it is for the greatest good, there should not be an infringement on the individual's rights. And this idea of that, economic holdings, that's your individual right. You merit it. It comes from your own blood, sweat, and tears, and nobody should tell you, not even the government, how what you should do with it, or that they should take it away from you. So it's kind of this resistance to taxation.
And equalitarian and egalitarian is the same thing, right?
So we have libertarianism is you make it, you keep it, you decide to do what you want with it. Egalitarianism would be more of what we have, like, let's say in Canada. It would be a redistribution.
But like the word on the board right now, that's egalitarian, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
This on the board, this on the screen right now, egalitarian is John Rawls. Okay. Let me skip over this. Okay, let me just kind of sort of now we have to let's get into this now. So these are sort of elementary definitions, like you probably came across this in elementary. What is socialism? What's capitalism? This is the famous quote from Adam Smith, that there is some utility in capitalism, but I again, what we call capitalism today, maybe Adam Smith wouldn't even recognize it. Okay. I'm going to try to make the case that sort of capitalism is no longer capitalism in a way, especially after sort of the bailouts in 2008 and so on. It doesn't seem to be capitalism. It seems to be socialism for the rich, and law of the jungle for everybody else. But obviously, look, there is, like, capitalism is in its essence, in its sort of original form, it sort of makes sense. It's something natural about it. People are motivated by their self-interest. People want to make a profit. People want to make a living. And there seems to be this idea that it's good for everybody, because then there's kind of a competition. But you also have this idea that people are discerning consumers, and they can make a distinction between what is quality and what is not quality. I think I have a slide on that. Okay. But is that the case, that people are actually rational, analytical, discerning consumers? That also seems to have gone out the window. Okay. Because there's a lot of experiments in, economic behavioralism and so on, that suggest that people are very, very prone to, influence and influencers and advertising and marketing and PR campaigns, that no, maybe we are not as discerning as we would like to think, that we are sort of a kind of a rational machine, and that we are very, very utilitarian in our core, that we have a certain amount of money. We want to maximize the use that we can get out of this money. And therefore, we're always sort of weighing pros and cons. Should I buy my bread here? Should I buy my bread there? Is it worth the time and energy to go there? Is it worth the quality? That's very often not the case. Okay. But there is something to capitalism. which I think is sort of, it's gone sort of rogue now. It's gone sort of a bit out of control. Now there's a lot, we're going to start talking about Marx, and we're going to kind of put that into a bit of context. But this is the famous quote, okay? It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Yeah, that's clear, okay, and that's fair. So okay, let me just jump over this. So yeah, this is kind of the point that I was making, is all this sort of behavioral market behavior, economic behavioral studies. You can, what would happen if you auction off a $20 bill? This is kind of a game you can play. If you auction off a $20 bill, but you put as a condition that both the second place highest bid also has to pay, what you end up getting is a funny scenario where the $20 bill actually gets off auction for more than $20, because at one point you enter into a kind of a zero-sum game where you're just trying to cut your losses, and you don't want to be the one that has to pay money unnecessarily. And what you get in that circumstance is that the $20 bill is valued more than $20. Okay, so it's simple, you know, like this. I have this kind of wine example. Is you can put a good bottle of wine inside a cheap bottle, and people will judge the wine to be cheaper based on the appearance of the bottle, and vice versa. You can take a pretty bad wine and put it in a very expensive looking bottle, and people will rank it as being higher, okay, as opposed to when they ranked it in their original bottles. If you play, let's say, I don't know why I have all these wine examples. If you play Italian music in the wine store, you end up selling more Italian wine unconsciously. Okay, if you play more French music, you sell more French wine. And so there is this idea of the sort of the rational choice theory, that nobody will make, that we as rational beings will not make a choice which deviates against our best interest. And it seems to say, it seems to be like, no, actually we're a little bit crazy. Okay, we are a little bit more impulsive and instinctive and emotional in our market behavior than we would think, and then that was actually presupposed in the sort of the roots of capitalism. Let me skip over this. So let's get right into this text, okay? And I want to proceed sort of very carefully with this text. Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto. Maybe some of you have read it. There's some interesting stuff in it. There's a lot of stuff that can be sort of criticized as well. So let me tell you sort of what I want to do with this. Is we have to understand, first of all, that this is one of the most important documents in modern history. It like literally changed the geopolitical landscape. It changed the course of history. That's point number one. Point number two is, with regards to Karl Marx, okay, point number two is we need to make a distinction between, what I'm talking about is specifically this economic idea, okay, and specifically the critique of capitalism, which I want to nuance in just a second. But we often hear now sort of Marxism. You hear a lot of people, especially sort of kind of these YouTube public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson and so on, kind of critiquing Marxism. Marxism is this idea that there is always an oppressed group, okay, and the oppressed group has sort of been ripped off, and not even only economically. Economically is one major sense in which they've been ripped off. And there's these kind of deep injustices that sort of, as we touched upon, and there's some truth to it. They become sort of self-propagating. That when you're poor, as we said, it's expensive to be poor, and when you're rich, people start giving you stuff for free. So it becomes a kind of a self-propagating, amplifying, vicious circle. But when I talk about Karl Marx, do not associate it with sort of marginalized groups, identity politics. There's always looking at things from the perspective of oppressor and oppressed. Let's forego that. Okay, we're looking at simply now. This connects to the other point that I want to make, which is when we talk about Karl Marx, a lot of people talk about communism, because this text was, in some sense, the source of, or one of the sparks of, the experiment of communism that took place, especially with the Russian Revolution and all that stuff, China, Cuba, everything that followed. Okay. Karl Marx is not actually, he doesn't actually say that much about communism. Communism is a kind of this hypothetical thing that he believes will necessarily result. Okay, I'm not entirely sure about that, but basically he sees it as kind of he makes this kind of historical prediction that inevitably the working class will overthrow the bourgeoisie, the people, the class that owns the means of production, and in overthrowing them, there's always a temptation that they will simply just replace them, and they will become, having been oppressed, they will become the new class of oppressors temporarily until it flips over again, and it flips over. I think that's a little bit simplistic, and I think that it's sort of it's a hypothetical prediction. So let's forego that. Okay, what I'm talking about with Karl Marx is really his primary obsession, which is a critique of capitalism. He has a sort of a fascination with capitalism. And he admits, okay, let's just jump right into it. Let me skip over this, okay? This whole sort of division and assumption that there are these two classes and there's this perpetual historical struggle, and that once, basically he sees he says societal classes are really economic classes. The true class that really matters is your economic standing. There might be some truth to that. Okay, but he divides it up that way. Some people say, it seems a little bit arbitrary to divide it up that way, and that there's this perpetual struggle, which which he believes will inevitably end in sort of the overthrow of privatized property, and everything will be sort of publicly owned and operated as sort of a collective. Okay, and then again, even collectively owned and operated, you can think about that in a kind of the good light. You can also think about that in the bad light. In the good light, we've had examples of that. Let's say I've heard of engineering firms where, let's say you'll have 20 or 30 people that work there, and they all have a share in the company. It's run more as a sort of a collective or as a cooperative rather than a sort of corporation, and that can work. You're a sufficiently small group. You can sit down, you can sort of talk about the issues, you can come to consensus, you can buy your way out if you want, if you don't want to participate anymore. The flip side of sort of the commons, what is collectively owned and operated, is again the critique of one critique that some people make is that when it is run collectively, it isn't run well. It's not run efficiently. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes things that are run publicly sort of get neglected, or I don't know, people get lazy. And what you also get is sort of the tragedy of the commons. When there isn't a sense of belonging or ownership, people do not really care. People maybe do not care as much as if they have a sense of ownership of that thing. I don't know, maybe, I don't know. The example of, let's say, a bus driver comes to my mind. Maybe, let's say I don't know why this example came to my mind, a bus in particular. But let's say the conditions of the bus and the litter on the bus, maybe the bus driver as an employee or as something that is publicly run, even the bus itself, insofar as that it's kind of publicly owned, the mechanics that work on it, might be unionized, and that's kind of an argument that maybe because they're unionized, they really don't care. They know that they're going to get paid regardless at the end of the day. So it gradually sort of, starts to deteriorate. That might be true, it might not be true, but there might be some truth to it. Okay, it's basically called the tragedy of the commons. Now, when something is collectively owned, that you have this sort of diffusion of responsibility, and nobody individually cares for it. That's what we get with a lot of public areas, like our rivers and our beaches. A friend made that point, like, look, nobody owns the beach. He was talking about, let's say, a specific beach in Laval. He says if you go there on a sunny day, everybody's there. But then when the neighbors get together and they make a post on Facebook and they say, okay, this afternoon we're going to spend 2 hours and it's going to be a communal thing, we're going to clean the beach, nobody shows up. So you can see that sort of translating to sort of economic thing. But let's forego this whole assumption, this sort of theoretical and historical analysis of class struggles, and let's just jump right into his analysis of capitalism. And what I want you to retain here is what are some of the arguments that he makes against capitalism? Okay, so let's jump into it. These are from this point onwards. These are some extracts from the capitalist, the Communist Manifesto, and he has an obsession with kind of capitalism. He has a kind of a love-hate relationship with it. He admits that capitalism is a fantastic machine. Okay, he admits it. He says capitalism has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, Gothic cathedrals. So he's saying there has never been a force of moving and construction and constructing and making things as capitalism has. Okay, it has really awakened a massive force. So he's impressed by that. Okay, it does have a massive force to it. The problem, one of the first problems, is that this force, the RPM gets too high up, and it starts to basically, he says, the machine rips itself apart because it gets out of control. It's so efficient at producing that it doesn't know how to slow down. And we also have this idea. Okay, another idea that arises from this is a fundamental wealth gap that arises, and that wealth gap, he says, can basically make people be so far apart that the poor do not understand the reality of the rich, definitely not, and the rich consequently do not understand the reality of the poor. And there's a kind of a divide, there's a kind of a chasm that over time gradually opens up. So there's a few things here. First of all, you can imagine, let's say, level of wealth. Let's say this is the lowest class, and this is, let's say, the highest class. You have this idea that everybody's generally increasing their real wealth over time. That we are, even, let's say, a poor person living in Canada today is probably better off than a rich person living in ancient Rome. Okay, in terms of, well, the Romans did a pretty good job with water, but in terms of, let's say, actually, and that's not necessarily true. There's still some communities in Canada, let's say some Aboriginal communities, that don't even have clean drinking water. But for many people, you have electricity, you have all the wonders of the modern world and of industrialization. You have food is readily available, clean drinking water is readily available. Medicines for conditions and diseases that existed, many diseases have been eradicated, and many diseases we know how to deal with. Okay, but now maybe as a result of capitalism and production and global warming and so on, maybe we're figuring out how to create even new diseases. Okay, so again, it might start backfiring. There's two problems here. One, which I've mentioned, which is, yeah, sure, everybody's condition is getting better. We are better off than, let's say, people living a few millennia ago, if not, like, let's say, electricity and so on. We're better off than even a few people a few centuries ago. But the gap increases. That's one thing. So that there is a kind of a disconnect. There is a loss of communication between the people that run the show and the people who are having to play along. And another thing is, we have this fantasy of unlimited growth, that it's good and it's gonna keep getting better. And now there are many ways that we can improve our life materially. But then you have to ask yourself, is this the direction that capitalism is actually going? And we touched upon this, you know what I mean? We touched upon this with many presentations dealing with sort of technology, touched upon it with planned obsolescence. Like how many phones do you need? How fast do we need a Visa transaction to go through? How convenient does my life, how convenient does my life have to be that everything has to be like in plastic? So, in some sense, the things that we're doing now are not really giving us more leisure or more happiness. You can imagine, for instance, we are continuing to produce the way that we produce, and that has been correlated with an increase in our happiness over time. But now our happiness is basically plateaued, but we're still making more and more shit, which is actually undermining our happiness because we're covered. There's plastic pollution and there's the kind of increased wealth gap. So there are many reasons to be unhappy, actually. Okay, I have to go quickly here. So one of the main problems, he says, is basically it runs out of control. There's no when to stop, because this idea of sort of competition always is forcing you to produce more and more and more, because you can't sort of sit on your laurels and say, well, this is sort of my rate of production and I'm happy with it. That might be good for a while. You can sort of plateau and you can be very, very content. I have this number of workers. This is how many products we make. This is how much we sell for in a year, and we're good. After a while, if you stay at that level, you're going to be rendered obsolete. And this nice livelihood that you now enjoy is therefore subject to obsolescence in a way. Or even if that's not true, even if you, let's say, really figured out something, there may always be that lingering idea in your head that I'm a small business owner and it's working out well for me. But, this other guy is coming around the corner, or there's this kind of multinational company that's coming around the corner. So that might be true or might not be true. But in either case, you're this idea of innovate, produce, increase productivity. I just want you guys to visualize that. Okay, that whole thing with the Suez Canal, the Ever Given or whatever, stuck in the Suez Canal for about a week. And it said it's costing the world economy billions and billions of dollars, and there's like a backlog of hundreds of ships waiting for this thing to get dislodged, so that the international trade can continue. And you realize that one of these cargo ships is the size of the Empire State Building, full of containers of all kinds of goods. Okay, you realize we don't really get the glimpse of the global market that we now live in. It sort of operates sort of behind the scenes, but it's massive. Okay, you don't realize that the clothes that you wear and the shoes that are on your feet, the whole chain of production and of exchange, which has made that commodity available to you. Okay, I bought toothpicks the other day and they're made in China. It's like, look at this, like a tiny little commodity has traveled further than most people will ever travel in their entire life. A fucking toothpick, okay. So let me go through these a bit quickly. But basically, another problem that he says is capitalism, he's kind of talking about almost like a virus. It nestles itself everywhere. So everybody's operating on the same system. You know what I mean? It's not like back in the day. Back in the day, if one civilization failed, and there were civilizations that failed, let's say like Easter Island and so on, there were other people with other cultures, with other rules, with other, modes of operating, that even though one civilization failed, other civilizations, there was a kind of a civilization diversity, so to speak. There was a kind of a biodiversity, okay? Whereas now we are, we're like our crops. It's all monoculture. So there is no diversity. We're all operating on global capitalism. And so if it fails, you see that's what happened also in 2008. When it starts to fail, it takes down everything simultaneously. Okay, what happens in the stock market in Japan affects what happens on Wall Street and vice versa. He says it settles everywhere, nestles itself everywhere, and us too as individual consumers. As this increases, so do our appetites also increase. So we become reliant on it. We lose in some sense self-sufficiency. Many people in the world are satisfied eating basically, dal and rice, basically eating lentils, legumes and rice. But once you start getting rich and you start getting that kind of, it's very tantalizing. It's very exciting. You know what I mean? So back in the day, people would only drink, La Batte 50, but now you want to drink whiskey from Japan and you want to drink Stella Artois, and you get kind of refined, back in the day, they said, my grandfather said back in the day, there were basically things would be in season. Fruits and vegetables would be in season, and that was it. All you would get from other countries would be basically like pineapples and bananas. Now you have every imaginable fruit available all year round, because when it's not in season in this country, it's in season in another country. And you lose that sense of self-sufficiency. You even lose that sort of connection to the land, because everything is always a perpetually available commodity. So he says it creates a universal independence of nations. Okay, let me go on. It creates a world after its own image. That's what I said. Basically, we're all running on capitalism software. So if it starts to glitch, or it starts to get a bit sort of out of whack, the other point is that there's nobody who's at the helm. There's nobody steering it. It is a machine that has a life of its own. And that's the point that I'm going to make in a second. Another problem is, and this is a point that we made earlier, while real wealth is, you can argue it as, is perceiving it as being increasing, the wealth gap is also increasing tremendously. So that's what we call sort of the Gini index, the analysis of wealth disparity in any given country. So let's say if you look at the United States, the rich are extremely rich and the poor are quite poor. So if you think of this as a kind of I read this economic article a few years ago, but basically they said, now it's probably even worse with the pandemic, but they said about a third of Americans are defined as living in poverty. Another third of Americans are basically 1 or 2 paychecks away from being in poverty. So they're completely dependent on their work. If they're out of work for basically a month, they're now in poverty. Even let's say debt in Canada is phenomenal. And simultaneously, so you have basically about half of the United States that lives in poverty, defined poverty. And then you have, you've heard like 1% owns, let's say, what is it, 50% of the wealth. And then it telescopes even further. So if, let's say, you look at 1% of the top 1%, then they'll own, let's say like 10% of the wealth. You know what I mean? So it becomes even more disproportionately true. The more telescopic, the more you get zoomed in, and that creates all kinds of problems. Okay, there's some people that have commented that it's not poverty that creates crime and social unrest; it's relative poverty. If everybody's poor, then you don't feel the need to go around stealing, because who are you going to steal from? But if you're poor and somebody else is rich, and you perceive that they're being poor, they're rich as kind of, they're sort of thieves, then it makes you angry, and you might get sort of violent theft. So he says there's too much, and this is the kind of the point I was making earlier, is the production, the way where it's going, is not really increasing our life materially in a way that is sort of satisfactory. He says it's no longer doing more and more of the same, having more and more cheap commodities that come from China that I can use and throw away, is not giving me a sort of a deep satisfaction. It's not giving me more of a satisfying life at this point. If anything, it's giving, it's making us feel bad. It's making us feel like useless, helpless, bullshit consumers. So he says the productive force, this is very interesting. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to develop, to further develop the conditions of bourgeois property. So in other words, again, that goes to the point of marginal utility. How many cars can you drive? How big of a house can you own before adding more square footage does not increase meaning or happiness in your life? So doing more and more of the same, being more and more wealthy and extravagant, and having more and more stuff is not furthering our development in a sort of a real way. And then what he says is also as a force of this seems so, there might be some truth to that, especially during the pandemic. So what does he say? He says, let's say a small business owner cannot compete against a multinational company, so they have to close their doors. And further, this is kind of exacerbated even further by the pandemic, whereas let's say if you're a small restaurant owner, good luck, you might not have the means or the money to get somebody to develop, let's say, a takeout app for you, but all the big companies automatically, they already have a takeout app. So I imagine their sales I don't know, McDonald's sales, the sales of McDonald's, have they gone up or have they gone down? I don't know. They might have gone up because now everybody's ordering takeout and they facilitated takeout. But there's some like, let's say there's some small businesses that were never arranged to only do takeout. Okay, but this is kind of a specific context of the pandemic. He says this is generally true. Okay, the lower strata of the middle class basically get sucked into just the laborer. You become just a laborer, and you are dependent on that job. Otherwise, you can't do anything. And he talks about, let me go over this very quickly, but basically modern labor is a very different character to somebody who labored in the past. Somebody who labored in the past was kind of an artisan. Their work was slow, but there was some kind of satisfaction in it. Whereas now everybody is it's this assembly line mentality. And furthermore, as we said, you can even be replaced by that assembly line. You can be replaced by a robot or an AI. So this idea that he says the modern laborer becomes an appendage of the machine. He becomes a kind of a cog of the machine. It's it's a dehumanizing alien labor. So let's say the person in some Asian country who all day long puts the space bar into the keyboards as the keyboards roll along the assembly line. Their job, 12 to 14 to 16 hours a day, is to do the same task of, I'm the person who puts the keyboard in, and then it moves along and I put another keyboard, and it moves along and I put another keyboard. And I don't see where this line starts and I don't know where it ends. Okay. All I know is this is my job. Human beings were not designed to do a robotic task repeatedly for hours and hours again at a time. You say, well, that's okay because they're going to be replaced by machines. That's okay if they're going to be replaced by machines if they then have a secured livelihood. Otherwise, as we said, if there's no, I don't know, this idea of universal basic income, is this a solution? Because if you give money people, but if you give money to people, but they have no sense of purpose, and so I guess so much of our sense of purpose is related to our doing, our involvement, our tasks. I don't know. So we might have a big sort of identity crisis in the coming decades when there's nothing left for us to do. Besides what, besides watch TV all day long. I don't know. Okay, let me skip over this. Again, this whole point of the modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of the existence of his own class. Okay, now this is a very strong quote. Again, I'm not prescribing this, I'm not advancing this, but it is sort of interesting to contemplate. He's obviously coming out swinging as a kind of a polemic. He's attacking capitalism. And we can ask ourselves, is there an element of truth to this or not? But this is a kind of a strong quote. It says, the relationship between the ruling class and the class that is being ruled. So in this case, he's talking about the bourgeoisie, that is the property owners. They own the means of production. They generate a revenue just because they have this machinery, they have made this investment. Whereas the laborers operate the means of production, but they do not partake in the same share of the revenue. So he says this relationship between, let's say, the owner and the worker. He says every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. Okay. But this is where it gets interesting. He says, but in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it, under which it can, at the least, continue its slavish existence. That's interesting. So in other words, if you're going to take advantage of somebody, you at least have to keep them alive. If you're going to have a slave and you're going to utilize the labor of your slave, you have to understand that you have to keep them alive. Okay. But he says modern society has the distance between the classes is so far apart that you have lost even a connection to your slave. You don't have to. You don't see them as having to stay alive anymore. You basically squeeze them until they drop dead. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to the slave within his slavery. So therefore, he says, therefore, what the so basically what he says is capitalism starts to eat away at its own foundation. It's such a machine that it starts to literally soak up, like a black hole, the foundation upon which it operates. Okay, I guess and now he's not even talking about environmental aspect of modern day international markets and so on. He's not even talking about the fact that the diesel engine in the cargo ship that's stuck in the Suez Canal, that the diesel engine is basically the size of my house and is pumping away. And there's no way to replace that with any combination of renewable energies. So there's not even, but if you take sort of the environmental aspect in relation to sort of the international economy, then yeah, you see that like literally you are eating into the natural capital that's there. You are literally undermining the basis of the planet to potentially continue growing trees for lumber, and animals for food, and agriculture for food and all this stuff. So it's interesting. It cuts from under its feet the very foundation upon which it produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own grave diggers. It's very bleak. And this is what we had. Okay, we had this idea of sort of an infinite growth. Okay, it can always go up and up and up and up. But we are, in some sense, yes, a life can always be improved. But in what, we have to ask ourselves, in what sense? Because I think we're starting to plateau on the material conveniences, going into a smart home where the lights are going to sort of turn on as I walk into the room, and my stereo is going to start playing my favorite playlist. That's not adding that much more. We're like struggling to figure out like what's really going to make us better off. We're really at a kind of we're like a little bit stuck right now. And we had this idea that no, it's just more products, more material stuff, but then what we get is this. We get to basically, you have sort of the exploitation. These people want to continue enriching themselves at the expense of the poor class. Let's say, the collapsing factories in Bangladesh because of sweatshops. And the other one is this. This is one that comes to mind. It's 2008. The financial collapse of 2008 was in part, and maybe largely in part, from my understanding, due to the mortgage, what do you call it, like predatory lending. So the bank owners were literally lending their workers money that they knew that they wouldn't be able to repay. So we're enriching ourselves literally at the backs of the livelihood of these people. Because you have a loan that's, okay, you're going to sign, and for 3 years, it's going to be at 1%, and you didn't read the fine print. So after those 3 years, it's going to go up to, let's say, it's going to triple, okay? Or I don't know, it's going to go up 5%, 8%, I don't know. And you're never going to be able to pay for it, okay? So you've basically been sold on a lie, and that's good, because then when you default on your home, then we as a bank can also come and we can sell your home, and that's just free profit for us, all right? And then what you get, and this is why I said earlier that it's no longer capitalism in the sort of the meaningful sense and the useful sense of the word, because one of the points of capitalism is if you take on a venture and you invest in something and it fails, you assume the consequences. But now what we have is what is called too big to fail. And the big companies and the big corporations and the big banks, especially in the United States, know that everything is so dependent upon them that if they collapse, everything collapses. Basically, the whole world economy collapses. So they basically now have the government and taxpayers as a hostage, because if I make money, then I'm allowed to keep it. Then it's capitalism. Okay. But if through fraudulent behavior we end up losing money, and the company might end up being bankrupted, then taxpayers bail me out. So it's capitalism when I'm winning, and when I'm losing, it's socialism. Okay, so it's not capitalism. So whatever that is, it's not capitalism. It's basically a kleptocracy. It's ruled by thieves. Okay, that's, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. It's basically too big to fail idea of capitalism, which isn't capitalism because you don't bear responsibility for your losses. Poor people, small businesses have to bear responsibility for, not ordering enough or ordering too much, bad ventures, bad investments. But once you cross a certain threshold, you are now sort of the new oligarchy, the new aristocracy. Okay, and your wealth is sort of locked in and self-propagating itself, and there's no way you're ever going to go down. Okay, so we're entering into what some commentators call neo techno feudalism. I don't know. We'll see where it goes. So this is the point. Is it's a machine. There's nobody that can say, like, if the CEO of McDonald's says, we need to basically eliminate. They do little gestures here and there. Oh, let's eliminate a plastic straw, and then that's good. It's good. That appeals to sort of the called it like greenwashing. It appeals to the millennials. Oh, they no longer have plastic straws, and that's good. And then business as usual goes on. But if a CEO says, no, I think, I think we're okay, and we don't need to, let's say, push profits further, they're going to simply be replaced. There is nobody with a stop button. It's a machine all on its own. So it's kind of like the Sorcerer's Apprentice here, Mickey Mouse. Why have 2 when you can have 4? Why have 4 when you can have 8, 16, 32, 64, 124? It keeps going. It's exponential. So the modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, who he has called up by his spell. Yeah, it's literally out of control. Let me get into this. Okay, that's it. Let me end this one here. Any questions or comments?